Before the muscle car explosion of the mid to late 1960s, a few bold American automakers were already laying the groundwork, building aggressive V8-powered machines in 1960 that had the guts, styling, and speed to qualify as early muscle cars. Yet most people don't remember these muscle cars, because the companies that built them didn't market them as such, and then let them fade away. Whether it was poor timing, corporate fear, here are 10 American super muscle cars from 1960, roaring beasts that should have started a firestorm, but instead were made to disappear.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10, the 1965 Plymouth Belvedere. A 990, a stripped-down, factory-built monster that was too hardcore for the street and too short-lived to change history, despite its incredible impact on drag racing. Today, we spotlight one of the most uncompromising machines ever to wear a Plymouth badge. A car so purpose-built, so radical, that it wasn't just a muscle car, it was a factory-engineered drag weapon. I'm talking about the 1965 Plymouth Belvedere, a 990. This car didn't care about comfort, style, or mass market appeal. It existed solely for one reason: to dominate the quarter mile. But in its single-year production run, it embodied the peak of Detroit's growing obsession with raw power and the rising war between the big three on the drag strip. Let's break down what made this beast special and why it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. By the mid-1960s, drag racing had become America's hottest grassroots motorsport, and automakers were fully aware of its promotional power. But it wasn't enough to build fast cars anymore. You had to build race-ready cars right from the factory and let your customers take them to the strip. Chevrolet had its 409 and Z11 Impalas. Ford countered with Thunderbolts and high-strung 427 Fairlanes. Chrysler? It had the Max Wedge cars in the early 60s, but they were just the warm-up act. The real blow came in 1964, when Chrysler introduced the 426 Hemi, first in NASCAR, then adapted for drag use. By 1965, Chrysler was ready to go nuclear, and the A990 was the warhead. At first glance, the 1965 Plymouth Belvedere, a 990, looked like a plain Jane midsize sedan. But under the skin, it was an uncompromising hand-built drag car, delivered straight to racers with a warranty that basically read, "Good luck." Here's what made the A990 unique: dual 4-barrel Carter carbs, solid lifter camshaft, 12.5 to 1 compression ratio, factory rated at 425 horsepower. But everyone knew it was closer to 500 plus. Race spec internals: forged crank, heavy-duty rods, aluminum cross-ram intake. This wasn't a detuned street engine. This was the same basic Hemi used in NHRA Superstock and NASCAR, dropped into a midsize shell. To maximize performance, no backseat, no radio, no sound deadening. Windows were plexiglass, not glass. Front fenders, hood, and bumper made of aluminum. Thin-gauge steel for the body. The goal: get the car under 3,100 pounds, ready to run 11 seconds out of the box. The A990 was never intended for regular buyers. Only 101 built, 56 automatics, 45 4-speeds. Offered only to NHRA and AHRA sanctioned racers. Came with a factory service manual explicitly stating it was not street legal. Chrysler even included tips for tuning and racing. This was Detroit's most honest drag car. No pretense, no compromise. In the hands of experienced racers like Dick Landy and Dino Don Nicholson, the A990 showed its teeth, ran low 11 seconds or even high 10 seconds in NHRA Superstock trim. Could dominate CFX factory experimental classes. Put Chevrolet and Ford on high alert. Its incredible power-to-weight ratio made it almost unbeatable in 1965, unless you were also running an A990. The race Hemi was tractable but brutal, with a torque curve as wide as a drag strip and internals that could handle 7,000 RPM without flinching. Despite its success on the strip, the A990 was never meant to last. Why? It was illegal in many states due to emissions, noise, and safety concerns. NHRA began to crack down on factory ringers, shifting focus to more production-based cars. These cars were being beat on hard, and Chrysler didn't want them coming back broken. The future was in high-performance cars for the street, like the GTO, Chevelle SS, and later the GTX and Roadrunner. So after 1965, Chrysler scaled back its direct drag packages. The Hemi returned in 1966 in full-size and B-body streetcars. Detuned, more livable, and mass-produced, but the raw A990 was gone. The 1965 Plymouth Belvedere. A 990 is often overlooked outside of hardcore Mopar and drag racing circles, but its influence is massive. It cemented the 426 Hemi's dominance. It proved that factory-backed racing cars could win straight off the trailer. It inspired a generation of superstock racers, and even modern drag pack programs from Dodge. It showed what happened when Detroit said, "Let's build a car that scares people." Number 9, the 1962 Dodge Polara 500 Max Wedge, a factory drag car disguised as a full-size coupe, built for the strip but far too brutal for the street. Today we're going to examine a car that represents one of the wildest moments in early American muscle car history, a time when automakers began building street cars that were barely streetable. Our subject, the 1962 Dodge Polara 500 equipped with the Max Wedge 413 V8. This car was not built for casual cruising or luxury appeal. It was a factory-engineered race car, sold under the guise of a production model. It was Dodge's declaration of war on drag strips across America, and its weapon of choice was raw, mechanical violence. It wasn't practical, it wasn't comfortable, but it changed the direction of muscle car engineering forever. In the early 1960s, drag racing was fast becoming the proving ground for manufacturers. The NHRA, National Hot Rod Association, had strict rules. To race in the super stock class, you had to use production-based vehicles with engines and parts available to the public. So the manufacturers responded by creating limited-run, race-ready monsters, barely legal for the street, just to gain a competitive edge. Ford had its 406 Galaxies, Chevrolet had the 409 Impalas. Pontiac offered tri-power setups, but Chrysler, through Dodge and Plymouth, went all in with a no-holds-barred big-block program known as the Max Wedge. And in 1962, Dodge dropped it into their newly downsized Polara 500, creating a street car that was never meant for the street. The Polara 500 was Dodge's top-of-the-line model in 1962, aimed at buyers who wanted luxury, flair, and prestige. But in a twist of irony, Dodge transformed this polite cruiser into a straight-line savage by installing the Ramcharger 413 Max Wedge V8 under the hood. Displacement, 413 cubic inches. Compression, up to 13.5 to 1 on race gas. Horsepower, officially 410 horsepower at 5,800 RPM, 5,600 RPM. Torque, 460 pound-feet at 4,400 RPM. Features, cross-ram intake with dual Carter 4-barrel carbs, high-lift camshaft, free-flowing cast-iron exhaust manifolds. The Max Wedge engine was named for its unique maximum wedge combustion chamber design, which created better airflow and more efficient combustion at high RPMs. It was brutally fast and almost unmanageable on the street, especially with the high-compression version that demanded 110-plus octane racing fuel. Dodge made this car with racing in mind. Optional push-button, torque flight or heavy-duty 3-speed manual, .391 or 456 rear gears. High-capacity radiator, beefed-up suspension, and reinforced driveline. Optional aluminum parts, hood, fenders, bumpers, for weight savings on special lightweight variants. Some versions even deleted heaters and radios to save every ounce for the strip. With drag slicks and minor tuning, a 1962 Dodge Polara 500 Max Wedge could run mid-12-second quarter miles straight off the showroom floor. Reach trap speeds over 110 miles per hour. Launch hard thanks to its low-end torque and brutal gearing. It had no real competitors in factory form until the later 427 Ford Thunderbolts and 426 Hemi cars arrived. However, its stiff suspension, peaky power band, and detonation-prone engine made it awful for real-world driving. The Max Wedge was prone to overheating, difficult to keep in tune, and completely unhappy with pump gas. Put simply, it was a dragster in disguise. Despite its performance potential, the Max Wedge Polara disappeared from the mainstream almost as fast as it arrived. Uncomfortable, loud, and rough on the street. High-compression versions required race gas that wasn't widely available. Poor drivability in traffic or cruising conditions. Buyers wanted balanced performance, not just strip dominance. GM and Ford began focusing on cars that were fast and street-friendly. Dodge realized the Max Wedge had a very narrow audience. By 1964, Dodge was ready to unveil something even more powerful, the 426 Race Hemi. It rendered the Max Wedge obsolete almost overnight, and the Polara quietly faded as a performance nameplate. Number 8, the 1966 Oldsmobile 442 W30, a factory-built performance machine designed with racing in mind, raw in its original form, and emblematic of Oldsmobile's brief foray into serious muscle car combat. Today's topic is the 1966 Oldsmobile 442 W30, a car that's often overlooked in the great muscle car arms race of the 1960s. Oldsmobile, a brand known more for comfort and conservative luxury, decided for a brief and glorious moment to build a race car for the street. The 442 had been Oldsmobile's ticket into the muscle car world since 1964, but in 1966, with the introduction of the W30 package, Oldsmobile turned the 442 from a sporty cruiser into a hardcore street and strip contender. This wasn't just about speed, it was about engineering a balanced, competitive muscle car without losing Oldsmobile's DNA, and doing so at a time when GM corporate policy banned racing. Let's break it all down. In 1964, Pontiac shocked the world with the GTO, stuffing a big 389 V8 into the midsize Tempest. Oldsmobile answered with the 442, which originally stood for 4-barrel, 4-speed, 2 exhausts, and paired a 330 V8 with a stiffer suspension. The problem? It wasn't very fast. By 1965, Olds dropped in a 400 cubic inch engine, finally making it competitive. But in 1966, engineers at Olds decided to go even further and create a special drag-ready package that would fly under GM's anti-racing radar. That became the W30, a barely street-legal drag car for the truly committed. So, what was the W30 package, and why did it matter? 400 cubic inch V8, based on the L78 engine, rated at 360 horsepower, but it was widely believed to produce well over 375 horsepower. Equipped with forced air induction via a factory ram air system, twin flexible ducts ran from the front bumper to a sealed air cleaner, feeding cool outside air directly into the carburetor. Special camshaft and valve springs shared with Olds' NASCAR engine. Heavy-duty battery relocated to the trunk, drag racer style, for weight distribution. Manual transmission only. Available with either close ratio Muncie 4-speed or a heavy-duty 3-speed. No automatic option. A clear signal this was a driver's car. Rear end, limited slip differential with 3.91 gears, optional 4.33S for racing, stiffer springs and shocks. Reinforced control arms, heavy-duty brakes, though front discs were not yet available. Subtle, no wild stripes or scoops. Small red front fender wells, a giveaway for true W30 cars. Optional W30 badging, though many cars went out the door, plain looking to avoid attracting attention. The 1966 44-2 W30 wasn't flashy, but it delivered serious results. Quarter mile in the 13.7-second range on factory tires. 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 6 seconds flat. Brutal low-end torque made it ideal for stoplight launches and short-track drag racing. With slicks and tuning, mid-12 seconds were possible, straight from the dealership. Very few muscle cars in 1966 could match that, especially with a manual-only drivetrain and a factory ram air system, a rarity at the time. So why didn't the W30 become a legend like the GTO Judge or the Chevelle SS? Only 54 W30s were built in 1966, all for drag racing homologation purposes. Most buyers didn't even know it existed, and Oldsmobile didn't promote it heavily. GM was officially anti-racing in the 1960s, and divisions were not allowed to overtly support motorsports. The W30 program was quietly approved and quietly executed, with little marketing or fanfare. Olds was considered the engineer's brand, known for reliability, not risk. The 442 itself was often marketed more as a gentleman's muscle car, not a drag strip brawler. The W30 didn't align with the typical Oldsmobile buyer profile. In later years, especially after 1967, the W30 package became more available and more tame. Automatics were allowed, emissions controls were added, and power ratings dropped. By the 1970s, the 442 nameplate was mostly an appearance package. The 1966 W30 is now regarded as a muscle car unicorn, a rare factory creation built for a very specific purpose. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Factory innovation, ram air and trunk-mounted battery, balanced performance, engine, chassis, and gearing. Number 7, the 1966 Mercury Comet Cyclone GT 390. A muscle car with real potential that ultimately got lost in the corporate shuffle and cultural noise of the late 1960s. Today we're examining a bold but often forgotten contender in the muscle car boom, the 1966 Mercury Comet Cyclone GT, equipped with Ford's big block 390 cubic inch V8. Now, Mercury wasn't known for building raw performance cars. It was Ford's upscale division, meant to slot between blue-collar Ford and luxury Lincoln. But in the mid-1960s, everyone wanted in on the muscle craze, and Mercury wanted some of that GTO magic. The Cyclone GT was Mercury's attempt to deliver excitement, horsepower, and flash, wrapped in a car that still carried a premium badge. The result, a vehicle with real power, impressive hardware, and even some racing credentials. Yet it failed to make a lasting impact. Let's explore what made the 1966 Cyclone GT exciting, where it stumbled, and why it faded despite being a legitimate muscle machine. Let's start with some background. The Comet began life in the early 1960s as a compact car, essentially a dressed-up Ford Falcon. It slowly moved up market in size and ambition. By 1966, the Comet had grown into a true intermediate, sharing a platform with the Fairlane. Mercury wanted to spice up its image and introduce the Cyclone as the Comet's sporty trim, and the Cyclone GT as its new high-performance halo car. This was Mercury's answer to the Pontiac GTO, Chevelle SS 396, and Plymouth GTX. Big power and a flashy midsize body. The GT came standard with a 390 cubic inch S-Code V8, producing 335 horsepower and 427 pound-feet of torque. This was the same engine used in the Fairlane GT and Ford Galaxy performance models. It used a 4-barrel carburetor, 10.5-to-1 compression, and hydraulic lifters. Standard was a 4-speed manual with optional 3-speed automatic. Optional limited-slip rear differential. With the right gearing, it could do 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds. Respectable for the era. Heavy-duty springs and shocks for flatter cornering. Front disc brakes were optional, a welcome safety upgrade, but it still retained a solid rear axle and leaf springs. More muscle than sports car. Unique to the GT were dual racing stripes, bucket seats, and a center console. GT badging, bright trim, and chrome accents. The grille and rear treatment were bold, very 1960s American flash. On paper, the 1966 Cyclone GT was solid. On the road, it was quick, with a torquey V8 that pulled hard in all gears. The 4-speed was geared for performance, and the exhaust note was appropriately aggressive. Mercury even campaigned the car in the NASCAR Grand Touring Series. Drivers like Parnelli Jones and Dan Gurney got behind the wheel of Cyclones, giving the brand some motorsports credibility, but for all that, it never quite connected with buyers. Despite its power, styling, and race heritage, the Cyclone GT struggled. Mercury didn't have a clear performance image. Was the Cyclone a muscle car? A personal luxury coupe? An upscale Fairlane? Buyers weren't sure. The Mustang was now a national obsession, and by 1967, the Cougar would launch as Mercury's new pony car, making the Cyclone look outdated almost overnight. GM was flooding the market with powerful, stylish intermediates. Ford focused its marketing on the Mustang, and Fairlane GT. Mercury had fewer dealers, less brand loyalty, and a marketing department that didn't know how to sell muscle. The Cyclone GT was essentially a Fairlane GT in fancier clothes. At a slightly higher price, buyers expected more than just stripes and chrome. Performance was competitive, but not class-leading. Today, the 1966 Mercury Cyclone GT is a niche collector car. It's not as iconic as the GTO or as beloved as the Chevelle SS, but it represents an important transitional moment when Mercury tried to bridge the gap between luxury and performance and nearly pulled it off. It's also one of the few 1960s muscle cars that offers a big block Ford FE engine, NASCAR roots, distinctive mid-60s styling, and relative affordability in today's collector market. Only about 13,812 Cyclone GTs were built in 1966. Not rare, but not common either. Number 6, the 1963 Pontiac Tempest Super Duty, a factory-built monster that helped define the boundary between muscle car and purpose-built race car, and whose fleeting existence tells a larger story about GM's uneasy relationship with performance in the early 1960s. Today, we delve into one of the most fearsome and most fleeting cars ever created by Detroit, the 1963 Pontiac Tempest Super Duty. On the surface, it looked like a slightly warmed-over compact, but underneath, it was a lightweight, fire-breathing factory drag car stuffed with a 421 cubic inch Super Duty V8, stripped of anything unnecessary and equipped with parts meant to withstand the punishing world of professional drag racing. This car was not built for the average consumer. It wasn't really built for the street at all, and fewer than 15 were ever made before General Motors pulled the plug. Let's explore what made the 1963 Tempest Super Duty so radical, why Pontiac created it, and how corporate politics crushed one of the most outrageous muscle cars before the muscle car era had even begun. Before we get to the car itself, we need to understand Pontiac's position at the time. By 1960, Pontiac had completely transformed its image. Just a few years earlier, it was considered an old man's brand. But under the leadership of Bunky Knudsen and John DeLorean, Pontiac embraced performance, not just in image, but on the track. Pontiac was deeply involved in NASCAR, NHRA drag racing, and road racing, and its engineers were turning out aggressive machines like the Catalina Super Duty, Bonneville, and Grand Prix, big cars with even bigger V8s. And then came the Tempest, a compact car introduced in 1961, sharing GM's Y-body platform with the Oldsmobile F85 and Buick Special. But Pontiac's version was different. The early Tempest had several unusual engineering choices: a rear-mounted transaxle connected to the front engine via a curved drive shaft nicknamed the rope shaft, four-wheel independent suspension, which was extremely rare for an American car, flat floor, compact dimensions, yet plenty of room for upgrades. These quirks gave the car excellent balance and handling, but they weren't originally intended for high horsepower use. That didn't stop Pontiac's engineers. In late 1962, Pontiac decided to take the Tempest racing, really racing. The goal: dominate NHRA Superstock class. They began by shoving the 421 Super Duty V8, an engine that had already earned a reputation in the Catalina, into the Tempest. But that was just the beginning. Key features of the 1963 Tempest Super Duty: engine 421 Super Duty, up to 405 horsepower. Forged internals, dual Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors. High-lift camshaft and heavy-duty valve train. Lightweight body, used aluminum front fenders, hood and bumpers. Plexiglass side windows. Some panels were acid-dipped to save weight. Final weight, under 3,200 pounds. Drivetrain reinforcements. Pontiac reworked the rope shaft and transaxle to handle more torque. Early units used modified Corvair Powerglide transaxles. Later ones switched to a modified Borg-Warner 3-speed manual, adapted for rear-mounted duty, purpose-built interior, Spartan, stripped interiors, no insulation, no sound deadening, no radio, meant purely for drag strip performance. Performance mile in the 11-second range, depending on gearing. Faster than most anything short of a purpose-built gasser. These cars were never sold to the public through dealerships. They were factory race cars, intended for select drag racers who had connections with Pontiac or NHRA credentials. Only 12 to 14 units were built, depending on the source. Each one was hand-assembled and shipped to racers like Arnie the Farmer Beswick and Mickey Thompson, who immediately put them to work on the track. These Tempests were nearly unbeatable in their class, combining big block power with compact weight and independent suspension. They were a nightmare for the competition, but the party didn't last. In January 1963, General Motors issued a corporate-wide ban on factory-sponsored racing. Number 5, the 1965 Buick Skylark Grand Sport, a significant yet often overlooked chapter in the early muscle car era. Today we're going to examine a car that played a legitimate role in the birth of the American muscle car era, but one that's often overlooked in favor of flashier, faster, or more rebellious competitors. That car is the 1965 Buick Skylark Grand Sport. On paper, it had everything. A big V8 crammed into a mid-size body, sporty trim, and decent acceleration. But in reality, it never captured the limelight, overshadowed by both more muscular rivals and Buick's later, more aggressive entries like the GS 455. The Skylark Grand Sport was a gentleman's muscle car, more about refined grunt than outright rowdiness. Let's dive into its history, engineering, reception, and legacy. By 1964, a performance revolution was underway. Pontiac had just launched the GTO, taking a mid-sized Tempest and stuffing in a 389 V8. Chevrolet followed with the Chevelle SS, Oldsmobile with the 442, and Ford with the Fairlane Thunderbolt, albeit briefly. Buick, long known for comfort and luxury rather than speed, felt the pressure to respond. But being Buick, it did things a little differently. It didn't scream teenage rebellion, it whispered refined brute force. That led to the creation of the 1965 Skylark Grand Sport, the brand's first real foray into the muscle car scene. At the heart of the 1965 Skylark Grand Sport was Buick's well-known 401 cubic inch nailhead V8, pulled from the larger Wildcat and Riviera. Key specifications: engine, 401 cubic inch V8, technically a 400 by GM rules. Horsepower, 325 horsepower at 4,400 RPM. Torque, 445 pound-feet at 2,800 RPM. Transmission options: 3-speed manual, 4-speed manual, or super turbine 300 automatic 0 to 60 miles per hour, approximately 7.5 seconds. Quarter mile, around 15.7 seconds. GM had a corporate rule in place at the time that prevented anything over 400 cubic inches from being installed in an intermediate platform. Buick cleverly marketed the 401 as a 400, skirting the restriction and giving the Skylark more torque than most of its rivals. But there was a catch. The nailhead engine was old school, narrow valve angles, limited breathing, and heavy. So while it had torque in spades, it ran out of breath at high RPM and added weight over the front wheels. Visually, the 1965 Skylark Grand Sport wasn't wild or aggressive. It wore subtle Grand Sport badges, dual hood scoops, and upscale trim, but it didn't shout performance like a GTO or Mustang. It was available in coupe, convertible, and hardtop form, giving buyers a choice of refinement or flair. Suspension upgrades were mild: stiffer springs and shocks, a front anti-roll bar, and better tires, but it was still tuned more for smooth cruising than corner carving. This was, after all, a Buick. Even its muscle car had a quiet dignity to it. When compared with other 1965 muscle cars, the Skylark GS was strong on torque, but soft on aggression. The GS was slower than most, due in part to its heavier curb weight around 3,800 pounds. It was also more expensive and had a quieter, more subdued character. In short, it didn't excite the youth market, and that would cost it. The 1965 Buick Grand Sport sold approximately 15,000 units across all body styles. Respectable, but not groundbreaking. It appealed mostly to older buyers who wanted performance without sacrificing comfort or image. But in the rapidly expanding youth market, dominated by Mustangs, GTOs, and big block Chevelles, the GS came off as too polite. It was a muscle car for someone who wore loafers instead of racing shoes. As the late 60s progressed, Buick doubled down on its performance image with the GS 400 and eventually the monstrous GS 455 Stage 1, a car that finally gave Buick serious performance credibility. These later GS models overshadowed the original 1965 Skylark GS, which became a footnote in the muscle car story. Few enthusiasts remember that Buick was among the first to join the mid-size muscle car game. Today, the 65 GS is appreciated by collectors who admire its rarity and understated charm, but it doesn't carry the legendary status of a GTO, Chevelle SS, or even a 442. Number 4. The 1962 Plymouth Savoy Max Wedge, one of the most hardcore factory drag cars ever built by an American automaker, and one that helped shape the muscle car era from the shadows. Today's lecture focuses on a true bare-knuckle brawler from the earliest days of muscle car history, the 1962 Plymouth Savoy Max Wedge. While it never had the household name status of later Mopar muscle legends like the Roadrunner or the Cuda, the Savoy Max Wedge was one of the first cars to blur the line between street legal and track weapon. Born during the factory drag racing wars of the early 1960s, the Savoy Max Wedge wasn't about style, comfort, or cruising. It was about one thing only: speed. And in that mission, it excelled. Let's dive into the engineering madness, historical context, and short-lived legacy of this misunderstood missile. In the early 1960s, American manufacturers were obsessed with winning at the drag strip. NHRA Superstock racing had become a proxy battlefield for Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler. Whoever won Sunday sold on Monday. Chrysler, looking to take down the fast Fords and Chevys, responded with sheer brute force, an all-out race engine called the Max Wedge, stuffed into lightweight intermediates like the Plymouth Savoy. And so, in 1962, Plymouth introduced the Savoy with the 413 Max Wedge Superstock package, creating what was arguably the first true factory drag car from Chrysler. The beating heart of the 1962 Savoy Superstock was the 413 cubic inch Max Wedge V8, officially named the Ramcharger 413. Key engine spec Stage 1. Displacement, 413 cubic inches, 6.8 liters. Compression, 13.5 to 1. Yes, really. Horsepower, up to 420 horsepower at 680 revolutions per minute, 5,600 RPM. Torque, 460 pound-feet at 4,400 RPM. Induction, dual 4-barrel Carter AFBs on a cross-ram intake. Camshaft, high-lift solid lifter cam. Exhaust, cast-iron headers dumped straight through. The cross-ram intake manifold was visually striking and functionally brilliant. With long runners crisscrossing over the engine, it gave the car stump-pulling torque at low RPM and screaming power at the top end. This setup also made hood clearance tight, so a special bubble hood was often used. To handle this monster engine, the rest of the drivetrain was beefed up. Transmission, either a heavy-duty TorqueFlite automatic or a 3-speed manual. Axle, Dana 60 with SureGrip limited slip. Suspension, firmed-up torsion bars, heavy-duty leaf springs. The Savoy was a relatively light full-size platform, and when stripped to its most basic form, it weighed around 3,200 pounds. This gave it an astounding power-to-weight ratio for its time. The 1962 Savoy Max Wedge looked almost comically understated. No chrome, no badging, no rear-view mirrors on some builds, no radios, heaters, or even back seats, optional delete. This was a no-nonsense package for racers. Chrysler didn't pretend otherwise. Many of these cars went straight from the dealership to the drag strip, and in some cases directly to trailers. They were also incredibly loud, borderline impossible to daily drive, and required high-octane fuel or even race gas to perform properly. But on the quarter mile, the Savoy Max Wedge was nearly unbeatable. Performance, 0 to 60 miles per hour, approximately 5.5 seconds. 1/4 mile ET, low 12 seconds, high 11 seconds possible with tuning. Trap speed, approximately 115 miles per hour plus. For a factory-built, warranty-honored car in 1962, that was blistering wedge wasn't meant for the general public. It was a tool for racers, and Plymouth and Dodge, with its Polara variant, only produced a small number of these cars. Depending on the configuration and production records, it's estimated that only 200 to 300 Max Wedge Savoys were built in 1962. That makes them exceptionally rare today, and very few survive in stock condition because most were immediately raced, wrecked, or heavily modified. Mainstream buyers largely ignored the car. It was too raw, too expensive to maintain, and too single-minded. Mopar muscle would become more street-friendly and mass-marketed later in the decade. But the 1962 Savoy was built before that era for the dedicated few who ate, slept, and breathed 1,320-foot sprints. Number 3, the 1967 Chevrolet Impala SS427, a forgotten heavyweight muscle machine from an era when full-size power still had a place, until it didn't. Today we're going to discuss one of the more underappreciated and often overshadowed muscle cars of the 1960s. The 1967 Chevrolet Impala SS427, the late 60s focused primarily on mid-size monsters like the Chevelle SS, Pontiac GTO, and Dodge Coronet. And soon after, pony cars like the Camaro and Mustang, there were still full-size cars quietly making serious horsepower. The Impala SS427 was one of the last of these full-size muscle machines, big, bold, and brutally powerful. But it was also a car that fell through the cracks of automotive memory. Too big to be nimble, too subtle to be iconic, and too late to catch the wave. Let's take a deeper look into what made the 1967 Impala SS427 a powerful yet forgotten player in the muscle car era. In the early 1960s, the Chevrolet Impala was a dominant force in the American market. It was stylish, luxurious, and could be configured from mild to wild. By 1965, the Impala had set a production record of over 1 million units sold in a single year, a feat unmatched by any other nameplate at the time. The Super Sport SS package was originally a trim option, adding bucket seats, special badging, and unique interior details. But by the mid-1960s, it could be paired with serious performance hardware, including Chevrolet's big block V8s. In 1967, Chevrolet took things a step further by pairing its largest engine yet with a full-size Impala body. Thus was born the SS427. At the heart of the 1967 Impala, SS427 was the 427 cubic inch 7.0-liter V8, a monster engine more commonly associated with Corvettes and Chevelle. SS427 engine specs: displacement, 427 cubic inches, 7.0 liters. Horsepower, 385 horsepower, L36. Or optional 425 horsepower, L72. Torque, over 460 pound-feet. Carburation, 4-barrel Rochester or Holley. Transmission options, 3-speed manual, standard, 4-speed Muncie manual, optional. Turbo Hydra-Matic 400 automatic, optional. Axle ratios, performance gears available for quicker launches. The 427 SS was capable of 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 7 seconds and quarter-mile times in the low 14-second range, depending on gearing and transmission. For a car weighing over 4,000 pounds, that was serious muscle. The 67 Impala was restyled with a sleeker, more flowing body and Coke bottle contours. The SS427 package added SS427, badging on the fenders and grille, a special blacked-out grille, simulated hood scoops, non-functional but aggressive-looking. Strato bucket seats with a center console, heavy-duty suspension and sway bars. Yet compared to the aggressive appearance of smaller muscle cars, the Impala SS looked understated. It was a gentleman's muscle car, big enough for the family, powerful enough for the drag strip. Unfortunately, this subtlety worked against it in the youth market. The rise of smaller, flashier, and cheaper muscle cars like the Camaro and Nova meant the SS 427 felt out of step, a relic of an earlier era. Despite its impressive specs, the SS 427 never became a major player in the muscle car hierarchy. It was expensive, heavy, and lacked the street racer image that cars like the Chevelle SS or GTO offered. Chevy's own lineup was competing with it. The Camaro SS 396 debuted in 1967 and was instantly more appealing to young buyers. The Chevelle SS 396 offered similar power in a smaller, lighter, cheaper package. The Corvette, of course, wore the 427 engine with far more prestige. The Impala SS 427 came across as a performance outlier, more cruiser than bruiser despite its credentials. Production numbers were modest. Only about 2,100 units of the SS 427 were built in 1967 with the high-performance L72 engine. Even fewer were ordered with manual transmissions, making them rare and collectible today. By 1969, the SS 427 package was quietly retired, and the era of the full-size muscle car faded quickly. Muscle was moving to the intermediate and pony segments, and the Impala went back to focusing on volume and comfort. Number 2, the 1964 Studebaker Superlark R2, a forgotten compact muscle car that packs supercharged power into a dying brand's final gasp of performance relevance. Today, we explore one of the most overlooked muscle cars of the early 1960s, the 1964 Studebaker Superlark R2. It was quick, it was supercharged, it was unexpectedly high-tech, but it was also tragically undermarketed and misunderstood. More importantly, it was built by a company that was already circling the drain. Studebaker. Let's dissect how this unlikely little powerhouse from 1859 South Bend tried to join the performance revolution and how it was doomed from the start. By 1964, Studebaker was hanging on by a thread. Once a respected independent automaker, Studebaker had been slowly unraveling due to poor management decisions, rising competition, and outdated production facilities. Its merger with Packard in the mid-1950s had failed to rescue either company. By the early 60s, Studebaker was trying everything to survive, including performance. Enter the Lark Don, originally introduced in 1959 as a compact to compete with the new wave of small cars like the Falcon, Corvair, and Valiant. The Studebaker Lark had found brief sales success, but as the Big Three flooded the market with options, Studebaker's advantage vanished. In response, Studebaker decided to push the Lark in a new direction: performance. The Superlark R2 was a performance version of the Lark Daytona, aimed squarely at the emerging muscle car trend, but with a twist. It wasn't just about big engines. It was about forced induction. The R2 stood for supercharged performance. Developed by engine guru Andy Granatelli, Studebaker's R2 package featured 289 cubic inch V8 based on a Studebaker block, not the Ford version. Paxton centrifugal supercharger factory installed. 290 horsepower at 5,200 RPM. 302 pound-feet of torque at 3,200 RPM, 0 to 60 miles per hour in 6.3 seconds. Quarter mile in 14.8 seconds with the right gearing. To put that into perspective, the Pontiac GTO was just arriving that year, with 325 to 348 horsepower. But without forced induction, the Superlark R2 was keeping up in a smaller, lighter package and with very little recognition. Supporting components: optional 4-speed manual or Borg-Warner automatic. Heavy-duty suspension. Disc brakes, a rarity in 1964. Limited slip differential. Sport-tuned exhaust and dual hood bulges. It was a muscle car before the formula had been standardized, and it was doing it with engineering sophistication rather than just brute displacement. Visually, the Superlark R2 wasn't much to look at, and that hurt its appeal. Its boxy styling, dating back to the late 50s, lacked the visual flair of the Pontiac GTO or Ford Fairlane. While it wore sporty badging, bucket seats, and twin hood bulges, it still looked like a grandma's grocery getter to many buyers. Studebaker didn't have the marketing muscle to convince the youth market otherwise. Moreover, the name Lark didn't scream performance. It evoked economy and modesty, the opposite of what muscle car buyers wanted in 1964. The biggest reason the Superlark R2 failed to make a splash wasn't the product, it was the company behind it. Studebaker was collapsing. In December 1963, it announced the closure of its South Bend assembly plant. All production shifted to Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, where facilities were even more limited. The R-Series engines, R1, R2, and the exotic R3/R4 variants, could not be supported in the new Canadian operation. That meant the Superlark R2 was dead before 1964 was even halfway over. Less than 50 units of the R2-powered Superlark are believed to have been produced. Some estimates go as low as 25 to 30. It was never mass-marketed, never seen in TV ads, and never featured in magazines the way the GTO and Mustang would be. Studebaker would cease auto production entirely by March 1966. The 1964 Studebaker Superlark R2 was a compact muscle car with brains and brawn, years ahead of its time in its use of forced induction and high-tech engineering. Number 1, the 1968 Ford Torino GT 428 Cobra Jet, a powerful and underrated muscle car that never quite got the glory it deserved. Today, we take a closer look at a high-powered but largely overlooked muscle car from the peak of Detroit's horsepower wars. The 1968 Ford Torino GT 428 Cobra Jet. With a massive engine under the hood and performance that rivaled, and in many cases beat, more famous nameplates, the Torino GT should have been a star. But instead it lived in the long shadow of Ford's other darlings, the Mustang and the Fairlane. This is the story of a muscle car that brought big speed but never got the big spotlight. To understand the 1968 Torino GT, we have to start with the Ford Fairlane, Ford's mid-size model throughout the 1960s. As muscle car fever took over, Ford realized it needed a performance-oriented variant that could compete with the likes of the Chevelle SS 396, Pontiac GTO, and Plymouth Roadrunner. So in 1968, Ford spun off the upscale Fairlane GT into its own line, the Torino. This wasn't a radical redesign, but more of a rebranding effort, wrapped in new sheet metal with a sleek fastback option and GT trim that implied performance. The Torino GT was the Halo performance model, available as a coupe, fastback, or convertible. Ford had been trailing in the horsepower arms race. The 390 cubic inch FE engine was decent, but Chevy's 396 and Chrysler's 440 were dominating the street and strip. That changed in early 1968 with the debut of the 428 Cobra Jet engine, a brute designed not just for street performance, but for domination at the drag strip. 428 Cobra Jet specs R code, displacement 428 cubic inches, 7.0 liters. Horsepower 335 horsepower. Underrated real output was likely 410 plus horsepower torque. 440 pound-feet, 10.6 to 1 compression, Holley 735 cubic feet per minute 4-barrel carburetor. Ram air induction optional shaker scoop or hood scoop. Strong bottom end and beefy internals for drag racing durability. The engine debuted at the 1968 NHRA Winter Nationals, where a fleet of 428 CJ Mustangs shocked the field with their performance. But the Torino GT also received the same engine, making it one of the fastest full-size Fords on the street. While the Mustang stole headlines, the Torino GT 428 Cobra Jet quietly became a sleeper hit. Thanks to better weight distribution and a longer wheelbase, the Torino could hook up off the line and run solid quarter-mile times. Performance figures: 0-0-60 mestactums. Low 6-second range. Quarter mile 13.5 to 13.9 seconds at 102 to 105 miles per hour. Top speed around 125 miles per hour. It came with heavy-duty suspension, optional 4-speed manual or C6 automatic transmission, and rear gearing options that made it ideal for the drag strip. Buyers could even get a competition suspension package with stiffer springs, bigger sway bars, and wider tires. On paper, this was a serious muscle car contender. So why don't we remember the Torino GT 428 Cobra Jet the way we do Mustangs, GTOs, or Chargers? Because it was overshadowed from day one. The Mustang was Ford's media darling, and the Cobra Jet Mustang stole the headlines. The Fairlane nameplate still lingered in people's minds, making Torino seem like a confused identity. The body style was longer and heavier than a pony car, less appealing to the youth market, and Ford made no major marketing push for the Torino GT. It was buried in catalogs, not on posters or in movies. Even within Ford's own lineup, the Torino GT was positioned awkwardly. Too big and mature for younger buyers, but too flashy and hard-edged for older ones. The 428 Cobra Jet option in the Torino GT was short-lived. In 1969, the Torino lineup was revamped again, and Ford started introducing models like the Cobra Sports Roof, essentially a drag racer with minimal trim. By 1970, the Torino Cobra and Torino GT split further, and the 429 Cobra Jet replaced the 428. After that, emissions regulations and insurance premiums rapidly choked muscle cars into irrelevance. The 1968 Torino GT 428 CJ remains a one-year wonder. A flash of muscle that came and went without the recognition it deserved.